Welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we're going to be talking with Agrii's David Leaper, Seed Technical Specialist, and Tim Horton, Technical Manager for Combinable Crops. With ongoing concerns about the reliability of oilseed rape, the question we will be looking into today is, should I be growing oilseed rape this autumn? Where does this crop fit? And how can it contribute to your farm's arable output? So David, perhaps I can start by asking you the question, how are oilseed rape crops faring this spring?
Well, this year has been probably the most difficult year for growing oilseed rape that certainly I can remember, because not only are we contending with the legacy of cabbage stem flea beetle and the problems that it imposes in establishment and growing and yield, we've had the autumn conditions, which we're all suffering from, and indeed we're still suffering from. So both of those have had a huge impact on farmers' attitude to oilseed rape, certainly going forward. The crop itself is quite variable across the country. In some areas, it's looking fabulous and it's growing away. But in other areas, it's either suffering to the stage where it might still be ripped up. And indeed, many crops have already been pulled up. So it really is a challenging time for growing oilseed rape.
And Tim, from your perspective, I know you take a lot of technical inquiries, helping agronomists and farmers alike. You know, what has been the key theme of those inquiries this spring?
Certainly this year, oilseed rape has suffered in the wet soil conditions. It really hates the wet weather, and that has caused issues. In fact, the cabbage stem flea beetle larvae levels seem to be lower this year, so that's been a bonus. But it was definitely a struggle to get the crop established in the first place. So other challenges have definitely been around weed control, where people didn't get early weed control on. The lack of opportunities has meant that they're still were chasing problems even quite late into the growing season.
It has certainly been a difficult autumn, winter and spring, hasn't it? David, can you remind us, though, why are we growing oilseed rape? What are the benefits to the farm business?
Well, oilseed rape, really came onto the scene in the 70s and really reached its peak in the early 2010s. And it became a very attractive break crop and a perfect entry for winter wheat, which is obviously the mainstay of UK farming. The market for oilseed rape oil is growing across the world, and that adds stability in terms of pricing. And as a non-grass crop, it provides a really good, or used to provide a really good opportunity for weed control. The timing fits perfectly with growing wheat and barley, both in terms of drilling, but also in terms of extending that harvest window. So it's the perfect crop. The problem is it used to be a cheap crop to grow. And when in the early 2000s, it was considered low cost. You basically even just throw the seed on the ground and it'll grow. But increasingly, because of diseases and particularly with cabbage stem flea beetle, it's almost become a specialist crop where it's all about attention to detail.
And Tim, what would you add in terms of the real benefits of having this crop in your rotation?
As David has mentioned, it does fit very well from a practical point of view of being outside of the main windows of other crops. It also has been, well, until cabbage stem flea beetle came along, was one of the most consistent margin return crops as well, fitting very well into the rotation in many situations. That has been challenged in all sorts of ways in recent years. But it's still, when grown reasonably well, it's surprising how it still stacks up economically.
Thanks, Tim. And David, what is the benefit of being able to establish this crop early in the autumn?
Well, I think if we just have to look at the situation we're in now, many farmers are struggling to put spring crops in, especially on heavier ground. And I think if you look back over the last 30 years or even more, there's been a shift towards winter cropping. And the reason for that is having a crop in the ground is less precarious than waiting for a good spring conditions to put in a spring crop. So we saw a shift historically to winter cropping, and that's been generally good. Now, of course, we are seeing changes in the rotation, and that over the last 20 years has been driven as much by blackgrass and other weeds to giving much more scope for using spring crops as a break crop. But at the end of the day, if the crop's not in the ground, there's less income from the farm. So oilseed rape's the first crop to go in, and historically, if you can get it in under good conditions, it has been reasonably reliable.
And Tim, just before we came on air, we were talking, or you were talking about some of the risks, some of the things you have to get right when establishing this crop in the early autumn. Talk us through some of those risks and opportunities of getting this crop in the ground.
Well, certainly last autumn was a classic example of how we had our normal bank holiday or just after bank holiday, late August flea beetle influx that did cause a lot of problems with establishment for those crops just emerging at that stage. Whereas those that had been drilled a couple of weeks earlier were already established. And although the flea beetle had a bit of a go at them, they certainly didn't do any significant damage. Whereas either the ones drilled after that, so the ones well into September, or the earlier August ones have generally survived. But certainly the later drilling window, although it can be very successful, it is more prone to weather conditions and a window of opportunity. Whereas the early drill window, if you've got that soil moisture, is more consistent for establishment.
And David, I see you nodding there in agreement.
I mean, it's fair to say, Tony, that there's a real trade-off here. If you drill early, you get your crop established. But the cabbage stem flea beetle has a secondary phase of its life cycle. You get more larvae in the plants and more damage in the spring. If you drill later, you get more adult damage but less larval damage. So it's a real conflict for growers knowing when to drill. But I think the reality and the test of time has shown that we've just got to get these crops in early and use whatever means we can to mitigate the effects of the larval damage.
So Tim, David talks about that conflict of getting that timing right. How do you get that right?
Certainly, obviously, for those growers who are growing winter barley or early varieties of spring barley, you have that early window for drilling. And if you've got good soil moisture and you know you're going to get good, quick, fast establishment, then certainly it helps to make sure you've got something strong enough in that early stages. We have seen things like companion crops, so buckwheat and other companions, can mitigate the larval damage to a point of the cabbage stem flea beetle and certainly improve the consistency of the oilseed rape. But it is a bit of a balancing act between getting it well established and understanding the risk from the larval damage as well as the adult damage.
And of course, if you go for early drilling, and we have seen, I mean, historically, oilseed rape was drilled from, let's say, the 25th of August onwards. If you go for early drilling, you increase weed problems. You increase disease problems, things like foma, like leaf spot, and indeed soil-borne diseases like verticillium and clubroot. So early drilling isn't without risk, and that needs to be taken into account when trying to offset the effects of adult attack from the beetle.
And how important is it to choose the right variety?
Well, variety choice is important. There's no doubt about it. I think on a positive note, we are seeing much better varieties now than we saw even 10 years ago. They've got generally vigorous growth habit in the autumn to cope with pest and poor autumn conditions. They've got rapid regrowth in the spring, which helps offset the effects of the larval damage, and broad disease resistance against foma and stem canker, light leaf spot, and increasingly we're seeing better tolerance of verticillium stem stripe. So all round varieties are getting much better.
To understand what the best arable crop varieties are for this autumn, have a read of the latest yearbook at yearbook.agrii.co.uk. Packed full of not only variety info, but seed treatment and our master seed service. Thinking about establishing the crop in terms of drilling and soil conditions, what do growers have to get right?
Certainly, obviously, oilseed rape is a lazy rooting crop, so it does need a strong root system that will build a large collared plant, and it's that thickness of stem that can help reduce the impact of the flea beetle larvae. A larger, stronger plant can cope with 2 or 3 larvae, or even the odd few more in the main stem. Whereas if you've got lots of thinner, weaker stems, a few larvae can be devastating to their survival. So it is about setting up a strong plant that can cope with all the range of adverse conditions. So looking at the state of your soil, making sure that it is in the right state for that crop to root well, hit some early nutrition for a strong plant, and also weed control. We do have things like Cat Turbo, which is a pre-emergence or very early post-emergence product. And to try and reduce the risk to the grower, we do have a risk share scheme on the Cat Turbo. So the grower will get a reasonable portion of their money back should they commit to that way. And obviously taking those weeds out early will help crop establishment.
Yeah, sure. David, anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think we've seen the breeders react in a similar manner over the last few years, because I think they felt that if they weren't selling seed, they were not, their income was affected. So they came out proactively with risk share schemes, and there are a number of schemes that are helping farmers cope with this upfront cost, the cost of seed or the cost of herbicides. To the extent where some of the schemes, if you buy a specific variety, you will get a full refund if the crop fails to establish, say, by the end of October. And I think that's really important, because oilseed rape's an unusual crop. All the costs are front loaded. Everything's in the autumn or early spring. So if you end up ripping a crop out when the larvae start to attack in February, March time, you've paid a lot of the cost of that crop already. So having that assurance that you can at least recover some of the cost and recoup the seeding costs and maybe some of the herbicide costs is actually gives confidence to the grower. We're not setting up farmers for failure, but it's trying to protect against these really unprecedented risks.
So talk us through the role and value of companion crops with oilseed rape.
Certainly, well, the companion crop does help with access to nutrition. Things like buckwheat can make phosphate slightly more available to the oilseed rape plant, therefore improving establishment. And there is a secondary benefit in that it definitely seems to reduce the level of larval damage in the oilseed rape crop as well. So you have a dual benefit there. Some people go for more of a mixed population of companion crops. Obviously, that increases the cost, but there can be other benefits to a mix rather than a straight single species companion. Whereas others will do things like just the buckwheat, which we know has a benefit, but it's all about setting these things up for getting the best out of them.
David, can we just touch on disease risk and how we can mitigate that risk in terms of drilling and varieties? Talk us through your thoughts there.
When we're choosing a variety, I mean, disease is the top of our mind. We've seen over the last decade the breeders stacking the genetics. So we're getting genes that have got enhanced protection against things like phoma and stem canker. We've got a collection of genes that the breeders can now use tools, marker-assisted breeding, to track genes. So we've got good control of light leaf spot, which has been historically very difficult and challenging to control. And we're also seeing better control of soil-borne diseases. So genetics is the first port of call. But of course, drilling data also has an impact, and we're sort of saying you're losing that now because we have to drill early. But it does have an impact on some farms. For example, where you may have brassicas in the rotation, turnips, for example, or even some of the cover crops, it can increase the risk of things like clubroot. And clubroot, we all know from college days, the impact that clubroot has on oilseed rape, it's catastrophic. And the spores remain in the soil for many, many years. So knowing your soils, keeping your eyes and ears open and looking for these diseases is really important. And of course, if we have things like clubroot, there's genetics that are available. And actually, some of those now are coming with exactly the same traits. Virus protection, good foamer, good pod shatter resistance. They've stacked the traits alongside clubroot. So actually, variety choice is important, but actually you do have some good choices when it comes to disease management.
So what if a farmer thinks, I don't want to venture back to oilseed rape? What are the alternatives, David?
It's fair to say that the choices for the arable farmer are somewhat limited in the UK. Of course, we have field beans. On some farms, maize has been introduced into the rotation where there's either a livestock or an AD opportunity. And winter linseed is very limited. So what choices farmers have got on heavy land particularly are limited. So oilseed rape does offer an opportunity. The other choices, and as we are seeing at the moment, farmers are considering some of the SFI options, and for example, taking a break into a rotational legume fallow. It's an opportunity which we haven't had before, and I'm sure many farmers are going to move that way. On lighter land, of course, we've always historically had more opportunities with spring pulses and with spring barley. And indeed, increasingly on heavy land, we've seen a big uptake on spring barley in spite of the crop having establishment problems in a year like this.
And so to bring all of your advice together, as we always do as we come towards the end of a podcast, Tim, what are the key elements that you would urge growers to think about in terms of considering oilseed rape, but also what they need to get right?
Key starting point has to be the establishment phase, making use of the conditions, setting things up for success, and making sure you've got the best chance of getting a good crop established using the weather and the soil conditions at the time. That has to be the starting point. The elements you add to that would be things like the nutrition, so seedbed fertilizers placed if possible, or using some like organic manures. Can also help with like chicken muck or sewage cake, also can be beneficial. Those with a companion crop give you the best chance of success to set the crop up. Early weed control is going to be beneficial, reducing the complications later on and giving you the best chance of growing a good crop. So the establishment phase is key to oilseed rape, but you've got to make sure that you're putting the right things in the right situations for success.
And David, what would be your advice to those who are listening today?
Well, I think many of you listening will have had your fingers burnt with oilseed rape. It's a crop which is a high-risk crop. Flea beetle, weather conditions, disease, poor harvest conditions are all having an impact. I think the message for me would have an open mind. There is still profitability. There is still a place from oilseed rape. For those of you who are growing it well, stick with it. For those of you who are questioning whether it has value, maybe consider it an opportunistic approach. If the conditions are good, go for it. Maybe select a variety that's protected by a risk share scheme. And if it doesn't establish, you've got the opportunity to then go into a later drilled wheat crop or indeed into the spring. So I think the value that oilseed rape brings to the acreage is well understood. It's about managing and reducing the risks.
Thank you, David and Tim, for sharing your expert knowledge when it comes to the opportunities with growing oilseed rape. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.